Hey everyone, welcome to Mighty Blaze's Authors in Conversation. I'm your host, Jane Roper. Very excited to have with us here today Priyanka Champaneri, author of City of Good Death, and Marie Myung-OK Lee, who will be in conversation with her. So excited to have you both. I have not seen you both in person for quite some time, but fortunately have in the past. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
So happy to be here.
Awesome. I will give some intros and then I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Folks who are watching, please give us your questions and comments. We would love to see them and we will ask the authors later on as we go. So Marie Myung-OK Lee is an acclaimed Korean-American writer and author of the novels Somebody's Daughter and Finding My Voice, which I believe was recently reissued, right? Oh, there it is. Nice.
28 years old.
Wow.
It's gone to college and back.
Yeah. Gosh, were you like 12 when you wrote it? My God. Her next novel, The Evening Hero, is forthcoming with Simon & Schuster in 2022. And you told me when specifically, and I'm forgetting. Was it May? May 2022. Okay, good. So a year from now, maybe you'll be back here with us again. Marie graduated from Brown University, was a writer in residence there before she began teaching at Columbia University's writing division. Her stories and essays have been published in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Slate, Salon, Guernica, and The Guardian, and elsewhere. She was first Fulbright Scholar to Korea in creative writing. And has received many honors for her work, including an O. Henry Honorable Mention, the Best Book Award from the Friends of American Writers, and a Rhode Island State Council on the Arts Fiction Fellowship. She has been a Yaddo McDowell Colony and VCCA Fellow. She has served as a judge for the National Book Award and the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Award. She's also founder of the Asian American Writers Workshop and was an Our World Writer in Residence for the Columbia MFA program. Thank you very much for being here with us, Marie. Priyanka Champaneri is the winner of the 2018 Restless Books Prize for New Immigrant Writing for her debut novel, The City of Good Death. People have had wonderful things to say about this book. Chicago Tribune says, although it is Champaneri's first novel, The City of Good Death has the confidence of a master storyteller. Drawing on the rich literary traditions of Salman Rushdie and Arundhati Roy, oh, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. I should have checked on that one. Champaneri's epic saga will satisfy armchair travelers thirsty for adventure and sick of looking out their windows, which is kind of all of us right now. Publishers Weekly has all kinds of good things to say about it as well, calling it ambitious, vivid, epic, a magical story of death that teems with life. Priyanka received her MFA in creative writing from George Mason University and has been a fellow at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, numerous times. In addition to being a writer, Priyanka is also an avid and experienced knitter. View her projects on Ravelry, if you are a member, or follow her knitting account on Instagram, priyanka.knits. And yes, I have seen some of these projects and my goodness, they are impressive. I'm a person who like crochets once a year. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna crochet.
That's probably why you write more than I do, Jane, because you're writing, you're not knitting.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I don't do enough of that, of the writing part either. So, all righty. Well, I'm going to let you two take it away and I will sit here listening raptly. Oh, I see Grace Toulousan is here in the audience.
Hi, Grace.
Grace is also a winner of the Restless Books Prize as well in the past.
Nice.
So, all right, I'll shut up and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jane. And thank you so much with Mighty Blaze. I'm just so excited that there's something that's so cooperative that kind of came out of the pandemic. And I'm just so pleased to be here. It's my honor. I'm so excited. And Priyanka, congratulations on your novel. It's amazing. So I'm just so completely happy to be here. And I think I wanted to start first by talking about how big this novel is. It's really big. It's like it's really thick as well. And it has the most gorgeous cover.
It does.
It has a beautiful cover. So could you first talk to us a little bit about this very intriguing title, The City of Good Death?
Definitely. So that title was actually not my first choice for the title. The entire time I had been working on the book, which I think at that point it probably would have been up until I found my agent, Lee Feldman. So it would have been like 7 or 8 years. The title of the book had been A Good Death. And I was pretty wedded to that title. I'm not a big title person. I think it's kind of how I react to people's names. I never remember anybody's name. I don't have an association with my name. I don't associate books with their titles. It's a very weird thing. But that had been the title all the way up through. And then when I met Lee and we decided to work together, she mentioned that another book had come out recently with that title. So we needed to start thinking about something different. So I just played around with a bunch of different things, and we ended up landing on the City of Good Death. I've been asked before whether folks living in the city refer to it internally by that name, and I don't believe they do. I have heard it referred to as the City of Light, which is very, very interesting to me because I think from a Western perspective, a lot of people likely think of Paris when they think of the City of Light. So I was really delighted to find that out, that there's an Eastern equivalent that also identifies in that way. But yeah, I didn't, the title just kind of came. It was something, it was almost like an assignment. I had to think of a title for it. And that's what it ended up being.
Well, that's what makes it so interesting. Instead of it just being an abstract, a good death, which there is that theme in the book, but then, so this makes your book based on an actual locale, a place where Hindu pilgrims still travel to this ancient Indian city of Kashi to die a quote unquote good death. And in this particular, from what I read in your novel, it seems like the good death is one that is freed from the endless cycle of reincarnation. And then in the sort of cremation, it becomes like the lights. And then, so the hostels where they spend their last days, like people have written about it and so forth. But it becomes this fascinating backdrop for this novel about these two almost brothers and their secrets. And so the novel's protagonist, Pramesh, is one of the hostel managers, and there's a bunch of layers on it about helping people to have their good death, and then how it all changes when there is a death of someone who's very close to him, sort of his quasi brother, who's also mistaken as his twin, which adds so much of the spooky tension. It's like, how do I explain this novel, because it's so huge and epic and intricate. So I think what I'd love to do, I'm going to just hold it up again because it's good exercise. So I just love to see what was the seed of this? What was the seed of how did this book come about?
Yeah. And I will also say, Marie, that it was when I finished my first draft, it was maybe a third longer than what this version is.
Wow. I could put one for each hand.
We can certainly talk about that whole revision process that it went to. But the initial seed, it happened when it was after college, and I had a coworker randomly send me a link to a Reuters article. And the title of that article was "Check In and Die in 2 weeks or Get Out." And it turned out to be about the death hostels of Benares. And, I grew up in a Hindu household, in a spiritual environment with this really, really rich, literary treasure trove of all kinds of books that my parents had collected. So I had, kind of a faint knowledge about Benares being this really special place in the place of Hinduism. But I had never bothered to unpack it beyond that. And I had never heard of the death hostels at all. It was something, in reading that article was my introduction to these places. And I was just immediately captivated by them. And I think that interest really hooks into two different parts of my identity. One being that part that had grown up in a Hindu household and had kind of immersed myself within this system of philosophical thought. It didn't seem strange or weird or, unique to have such a place, that, this very, very bare bones, these hostels don't offer any kind of amenities. They're literally just these like shelters, these buildings with these tiny, tiny rooms that have nothing in them. And somebody who wouldn't be able to afford to stay in the city otherwise is able to bring their family member and give them that gift, if that's what they want, of being able to pass there. And that did not seem odd to me at all. It just seemed like a necessity. Like, you're going on a road trip. We need a place to stop at night. This is a place to go and do it. But I'd also grown up in the United States. I was born here, raised here, educated here. And so I was very, very familiar and equally comfortable with this other lens, which would have seen such a place very differently. And from that lens, it was unique. It was a novelty. It was something almost totally out of the realm of understanding from that point of view. And I think just those conflicting, that just the dichotomy of those two things conflicting with each other, it just seemed like it immediately held so much potential for something, but I didn't know what at that time. This would have been like maybe 2005, 2006 when I read that article. So I was interested. I thought it would be cool to use it in something, but I thought maybe at that time, maybe I would write a short story set there, which seems ridiculous now. I mean, you can see how fat the book is, like to write a short story there. But I think, you know, all those years ago, that would have been what the limit of my capacity was, like to think of it as a novel, and certainly something, a very, very big, capacious novel would have been too overwhelming to think about. So it was a really, really slow process of coming to it in a way that I now realize was organic, but I never had any intention of writing a book, because the very big thing holding me back that I still feel a lot of trepidation about is the fact that I have no firsthand knowledge of the city. I've never physically visited there. So there were these big questions in my mind about what gives me the right to write about this place, what makes me qualified to write about this place. Just a lot of tick marks that I felt like were against me. But I just started reading about Benares, about death hostels, just all of this material that I could find on it, because I was just curious and I wanted to learn more. And it was a really long process of steadily learning more and more and more and more, and really organically one day finding a character walk through my head and hearing a bit of dialogue in my head. And it isn't until now, especially doing these events and really going back and reflecting on my process, that I realized in doing all of that research, I essentially built an imaginary city in my head. So I don't know that it matches Benares exactly. Of course it couldn't, because I haven't been there myself. But I would hope that it matches it pretty closely.
Okay. So it's sort of something when we talk about like world building with our students. But at the same time, you know, Marta Simpson, I think somebody in an interview, one of her books was set in Egypt or something, and they said, "Have you been to this place?" And she said, "Oh no, I never go till after the book's published." Like there is a tradition of that. Like even though there's a certain like, oh, it's got to be authentic, particularly if you share like an ethnicity of, you know, like the place you're writing about. I think there's so much conflation between, oh, you have natural knowledge of it because you're just the same color as people live there or something. So I don't feel like that should actually ever, in some ways, like that's almost more imaginative, just sort of, you know, I feel like Mona Simpson gets extra points for being imaginative, where, you know, sometimes ethnic writers get to, it's got to be, oh, it has to have actually happened to you or something.
Sure.
But that's sort of, so that's kind of leading me into my next questions, which is a two-pronged one. So tell me a little bit more, you know, like how you did the research. And then also, because it's so, you know, I had no idea until you were talking about it now, like what, you know, what your background was with the novel. It was so immersive. And there were just so many things about, you know, the rope beds or the schedule set by, is it time for chai? So how did you decide to use these details in a way that would be familiar to some people, but wouldn't be familiar to other people? Like, how are you going to integrate all that?
I should have told my publisher that with selling this book, they should include like a packet of chai, like in the back of the book, so everybody can drink some along with it. But I think that quality likely comes from definitely the research, which I can break down and talk about a little bit more, but also my own lived experience as an Indian American, as a Gujarati American. My parents were both born in the state of Gujarat in India, and they came here in the 70s. But our house was, you know, a Gujarati household. So the foods that we ate were Gujarati, and the language that they used in the house was Gujarati. And, you know, there's all the traditions and the holidays and et cetera, and being around that community. But my dad is also an incredible oral storyteller. He doesn't think of himself as a great writer. I'm not going to comment on that, but he is just a really magical oral storyteller. And my brother and I grew up he would just weave these tales of just his life growing up in his town. And I think for whatever reason, a lot of that sort of detail, especially the detail of domesticity, and you mentioned the rope beds and you mentioned, tea time and etc. That stuff is endlessly fascinating to me, regardless of culture. Because I think in many ways, they're the access points into a culture. If you know these kind of little things, these little traditions that are almost like that internal secret language for that culture, in many ways that helps you connect with folks identifying with it. And I just naturally, when I'm reading, I love reading those details in any book that I'm reading. I just find them really enjoyable. In terms of the research, I mentioned it started very organically, just wanting to know more. And so I started with, and I list a lot of the different sources that I used in the back of the book, but it started with a lot of ethnography and research articles and that type of thing. But I really felt like I didn't get a real handle for the city until I transitioned into more visual resources. So things like books of photography and watching documentaries and film. And then YouTube is absolutely incredible because you just have tourists who have been to Benares and they're just walking down these cramped lanes holding up their iPhone and you feel like you are there. So that kind of thing was really valuable. But I also have, even though I haven't been to Benares, I've been to India twice, only ever as a tourist. And I haven't been to that part of India, but I've been to other parts. And there are things that I feel are universal to the country, no matter where you go. And it goes back to those details of domesticity. So every place you go is going to have some sort of market lane. The bigger the city is, they're going to have many, many market lanes. But the vibe is often very much the same, this haggling, heckling, et cetera, et cetera. The smells are often very much the same. The quality of laundry hanging out of a window, what light looks like when it's filtering down on a goat having a nap in a corner. I mean, these are the things that I really packed away into my memory when I had visited there because I just loved them. I can't even describe, but I feel like I get a visceral thrill when I see something like that. It just sends these like sparks off in me because it just feels like the purest form of life in many ways. And I'm not an artistic person like visually, but I feel like if I were, that I would likely create some sort of painting like in that manner, like, featuring those kinds of details. So it was probably just my affinity for those things. And in terms of choosing when to use those details or how to layer them in, I think some of it was likely just instinctual to create texture and detail in the story. Certainly some of it might have been a crutch, like I'm stuck at this point. Well, they should just all start having tea and let's see what happens. Like just have Shobha like boil up a pot of tea and let's, they're all sitting around and they start talking. Or let's have one of them go out for a walk. And what does that person see as they're going down the lane? Who do they encounter? What are they listening to? That kind of thing. I think the way the book begins with this image of these two boatmen who find a body dangling from a boat in the river. And then it kind of like takes a really, really telescope outlook at the city and then really, really goes back in. That was really intentional. Just doing it in that way. And I think it was intentional also because it helped me. It was almost like a psychological nudge to myself that you're coming from it from the outside, but now you're like actually entering in. So let's take a really, really close look, even though you are coming from the outside.
Well, I think the relationships in the book are so if we're going from like the visual to just sort of like the literary sort of emotional heart of the book. So you talked a little bit about, so you had this backdrop and then you kind of felt like you had a character. So the manager of the hostel and his sort of twin, and it's so like I mentioned, it's so eerie because everyone thinks that's his twin. Is that something that just kind of came to you as you're writing, or is there any kind of sibling relationship that it was inspired by, or?
At the time, I was really fascinated by twins, and I was putting twins in everything. And I don't know why anymore. I was actually thinking about this the other day. I was like, why was it so important for Sagar and Pramesh to look exactly alike? And there were really good reasons for it when I was writing. I just can't remember what they are.
Twins are overrated. As a mother of twins, I can tell you, they're way overrated.
Not yours.
Not yours.
But there were I think I was likely really intrigued by the idea of somebody who's physically your copy. And how do you, certainly it's discouraged now, but like definitely when I was growing up in the 80s, you would see twins and immediately know they were twins because they were dressed alike, like everything was alike. And I remember when I was really young, if I observed a pair of twins, being confused, like, are they really the same person or are they different? And so I was likely really captivated with this idea of having somebody who is your copy and perhaps being encouraged to be the same person, but then breaking out of that and figuring out your own identity. But sibling relationships absolutely is something that has always been almost like a trigger subject for me. If I find anything out there, film, TV, books, whatever, and I know it features a sibling relationship, I'm likely going to want to take a look at it. It's just something I feel like I don't see enough of it. And that might be, maybe that's my own perception coloring that, but I feel like I never get to see enough sibling relationships. When I do see them, they're often these very combative, contentious, like Cain and Abel type relationships. And I guess I mentioned that I have one sibling. I have an older brother who I was really close to growing up, and I'm still very, very close to. And that is a relationship that has absolutely defined my life. Like, I would be a different person if I did not grow up with an older brother. And I think one of the reasons it captivates me so is it's really, like, depending on how many you have, it's the one person who has seen you from the earliest point in your life, especially if they're older. They saw you at the very, very beginning, and they have the potential to see you like for the longest amount of time. So they'll see every phase of transformation that your identity takes. You can't hide anything from your sibling. So if you're trying out this like emo, moody phase, like they can see through you and be like, yeah, I knew when you were a dork when you were like 8, like, you're trying to be all cool and stuff. But it's just something endlessly fascinating to me because you can't hide from them. But also I think in some cases that relationship can hold you back. You might be held back from becoming the fully formed person that you see yourself being because this other person is unable to let go of that identity that they grew up with. There's just so much potential there. So I wouldn't be surprised if I kept writing about siblings in some capacity. Maybe not twins anymore, but siblings, yeah.
Well, in the novel, so there's so many intricacies of their memories and some of the switcheroos and just sort of the plot things. So actually, I would love to know how big did the book get, and then how did you get it to where it is? Because now it's not excessive at all. It's just very big. It's very epic because it covers so much time and emotion. Actually,
it definitely got unwieldy, like towards like the end of the writing process. And at the end, it would have been, I think it probably was a third longer than what this version was. And a lot of that bulk came from the fact that I just love books like Midnight's Children and A House for Mr. Biswas, and just these books with a lot of side characters and a lot of side plots, and it's just so much richness and texture that's added. And lots of times with these side characters, they come on for a page and they do their thing and then they leave and you never see them again, and that's fine. But I love that. I think there's a lot of potential for humor in doing that too. And so that's what I had done. And, naturally, a lot of that ended up having to fall away. And I agree with that decision because it, ending up like cutting all of that out, it unfortunately cut out the bulk of the humor of this book. I think initially it was probably more evenly balanced between humor and somber. And now it definitely tips the scale to somber, but it was a necessary thing. Like it needed to become just tighter and more fast paced. And there had been some pacing issues with it before. We also, my editor and I, Nathan Rostern with Restless Books, ended up consolidating some characters as well. So there might've been 3 characters and it ended up turning into 1 character. that was really informative for me as a writer, just to see how you can do that, the different ways of doing it. But it was, various points of it were definitely unwieldy. There were times when I felt like I couldn't see the whole book. I didn't have it within my capacity. So what I would do is like make notes or make a list of what I needed to work on, and then just like concentrate just on that little bit and try to block out everything else about it. But it was really difficult because, as you've seen, like something that happens like in one part affects, it's got this ripple effect, and it affects everything else. So if I made a change somewhere, then I was going to have to figure out how to reconcile it everywhere. So it definitely, it was a painful process. And I don't know that I would have gotten the book to where it ended up being in published form without Nathan, because I needed somebody to be able to look at it with an outside perspective. And he also helped me do, I think, a lot of restructuring in terms of literally taking everything I had already written and just moving parts. And, that's all he did. He was just taking what, and just rearranging it and making it, just transforming the narrative in that way to make it tighter. I don't think I would have had the capacity to do that myself. Or if I did, it wouldn't have happened for like another 10 years because I would have needed that distance from it. Yeah.
How long did you work on the book for?
I started writing it in 2009 and revising it up until 2019. So it did take about 11 years.
Wow. Well, so then let's go from the editing to the other interesting part, the publishing part. And one thing I'm just kind of dying to talk about is that I feel like, and I do hear this directly, that a lot of aspiring writers seem to have a misapprehension about publishers are now only looking for diverse authors. And they think it's about like publishers are only publishing stuff about non-white culture, and it's harder for non-minority writers to get published, where the actual facts are that more than 80% of editors are white, and actually most of the authors being published are white, and it's actually harder to be published as a minority writer. And that's why it's wonderful that there are things like this, like the prize. Yeah. And so, I just love to hear about your publishing journey and how being South Asian writer, like writing about India, if that has affected your publishing journey in any way, positive or negative. I'm just dying to hear.
Yeah. So after I finished a full draft of the book that I thought was, good enough for an agent to see, I started that process, and I ended up finding my agent, Lee Feldman. And, I did a bit of a revision with her as well. And it's been about 2 years submitting the book out to everybody, like every tier of the publishing industry, and got the nicest rejections back. Really, really lovely rejections, like ones that, showed that these folks had obviously read the book and they loved parts about it. But for whatever reason, they just could not make the jump to actually acquiring it. And of course, you're never given a specific reason for why.
Nope.
But of course, that ends up being a bit of a thing that messes with your mind, because when you're not given a reason and everybody's saying no, then it's like, well, what's wrong with it? And how do I fix it as well? Yeah. So, and we also went to the United Kingdom and to India, and we got exactly the same answer. So yeah. And I think in one of those cases, when you asked me about whether my identity as, somebody with Indian heritage, whether that impacted that. I cannot answer that definitively because I'm not the person who rejected the book, but I do remember one rejection that did allude to it, and that if this book had been submitted around the time that Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake had come out, or Kiran Desai's The Inheritance of Loss had come out and won the Booker, essentially, if this book had been submitted when India was hot, then perhaps they could have found a spot for it.
But India's so big. How can there not be a spot?
Right.
And there definitely. I mean, obviously, India is massive. How could there not be a spot? But then also that speaks to why are we limiting like to a certain number of books depending on culture or depending on provenance? Why is it not instead like based on the type of story that you're trying to tell rather than the culture that it explores or the country that it explores? So
we've had too many beach novels by white women, we just they're not hot anymore.
I definitely had like, those moments where it was like, but I see a lot of this type of book, or like we've all had that moment where a book comes out and it's like, hasn't this been written about like ad nauseum over and over again? But it is what it is. One thing I realized very belatedly in this process was that it had nothing to do with me. It almost had nothing to do with the book. It is a business, and they are just looking to see if they can sell you or not. And I don't think there's anything wrong with understanding it from that lens. Obviously, as writers, we consider ourselves artists. And so it's not about the financial. It's about like, what are we trying to say? Or what are these questions that we're trying to answer? But I think when you are trying to enter the traditional publishing world, that's what you're signing up for. Are they able to sell you or not? And strangely, that actually was a great relief to me when I realized that. Very belatedly. I realized that after that, during that whole period, that it wasn't about me. It wasn't about the book. And once I thought of it in that way, I was able to be really unemotional about it too, because it wasn't anything I could control. Mm-hmm. But after that 2-year period of constant rejection, my agent and I had the conversation about how we should just likely shelve the book for now, and I should start working on something else. And I have to say that my agent never lost faith in the book. Every time we'd get a rejection, she would be like, it's fine. We just need one person to see the book. Like, that's it. We don't need everybody. We just need one person to see the book. And she always saw the book from the very beginning. Mm. So we had that conversation. And then a couple months later, I'm on our creative writing listserv, and this advertisement for the Restless Books Prize for New Immigrant Writing came through. And they alternate. They have the prize every year, but they alternate between asking for fiction or asking for memoir. And they wanted fiction that year. And they always have a guest judge along with the publisher, Alon Stobbins. And that year, the guest judge was Taya Obret. And I had read The Tiger's Wife. She had not published Inland by then, but I had read The Tiger's Wife and loved it. And the things that she does in those books convinced me that perhaps she might find my book appealing, based on the fact that in The Tiger's Wife, she loves myth. She loves folklore. She loves the supernatural and superstition and just stories on stories on stories, like all these things that I loved and had tried or attempted to inject into my book. So I thought, well, the book is already done. I have a manuscript and it costs nothing to submit to this prize. So why not? Let's go ahead and throw it out there. And then I forgot about it because rejection had been so constant and frequent at that point. And I really had let it go at that point. I needed to, because I needed to move on. That submitting to this prize was really just, I need to close the door on this entire book. And I don't want to look back 10 years from now and be like, I wonder what would have happened if I had submitted to that prize and then regretted not doing it. So I submitted to it and forgot about it. And then many, many months later, I got the email that I had won, which frankly is still astonishing to me.
Well, that's what's so lovely about it, because there's some, ways that more conventional readers might think, well, she's breaking all the rules. There's a flashback within a flashback, and there's not just one ghost, there's two ghosts. And so I kind of just love the expansiveness of that. And then a lot of times when I see these kind of novels that kind of break out of that, I always feel like, gee, I wonder if there is something more about, for instance, there are different ways in Asia that we tell stories, particularly like in East Asia, instead of like the Platonic ideal and the rising action and the climax. It really is more about kind of like what you do. It's more about like just having a bunch of stuff and having it come together and then there being less of a resolution than it just kind of being cyclical. It's kind of like because I'm Buddhist, and like in Hinduism and Buddhism, it's all cyclical versus linear, and it's got to go somewhere. It's got to be a plot. So I kind of really appreciate that when someone can do that and kind of break the narrative rules of that.
And I love that you're making it sound like that was all intentional, Marie, because I didn't.
But it still all comes. But that's the great thing I'm always telling my students is, you can't overthink it, and so a lot of it is just coming out of. The art is coming out of what you are allowing to come out versus your editor going, no, it's got to have a denouement and a plot and Platonic ideal or something. And I just wanted to add this other, because one of the things, again, that I just want to talk about a little bit about gatekeeping and about persistence. Being a writer is about being persistent. Mm-hmm. Roxane Gay wrote a piece in the New York Times that she found out that when she did a study that nearly 90% of books reviewed by the New York Times, 90% were by white writers.
Yeah.
So you're also seeing like there's a cyclical, this stuff gets reviewed. And then everyone's like, well, these are the good books. And this is probably what we want more of. It also becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the fact that, your agent was so supportive and you just super persisted with it. And talk to us more about persistence.
I will say one thing you said, Marie, that really struck me, and it's something that I got to do an event with Myung-OK Lee, the author of The Stationery Shop, who's one of my favorite people. But he made the comment, which had completely escaped me up until then, that tradition of these big, epic, capacious novels is very much within the East Asian tradition, or just like, within, Middle Eastern culture, Indian culture, certainly within that part of the world. And so if one is saying the reasoning for rejecting a book is this is not a literary trend, you are by default rejecting entire cultures for whom that is part of their literary history. And you speaking of the narrative, which is cyclical rather than like, with a climax, et cetera. I think that speaks to it's exactly the same space, that it can't be a reason for rejection because perhaps it's just a misunderstanding that this is part of that culture's literary provenance. That had not occurred to me before at all. And now I can't stop thinking about it. And I likely won't stop thinking about the whole cyclical narrative thing either.
And I wanted to just throw up a question here from Grace, maybe segue in a little bit here. And I moved us around, so it's covering my face instead of yours, Marie. I'll speak up better. Given the current rise in anti-Asian violence, do you believe our books have any role in combating this hate, or is that not something our books can even do or be asked to do, given the huge, complicated structural problems in our society?
I think you should go first, Marie. I can go first if you want me to. But
you can go first.
I think, so I've been thinking about this as well in terms of the social responsibility that any piece of art might have. And I think if it's something that the artist was always, or the writer was always moving towards, like that was always part of the questions that make up their world that they wanted to answer, then certainly, books can do that. But I'm also not somebody who thinks that it should be done like because of a certain moment in time that a piece of art has to address any sort of zeitgeisty moment. If it can be done, and if it's part of that artist's, I don't want to say agenda, but like just something that they're primarily interested in, then definitely. But I also think that any book fulfills a social responsibility because it's building empathy. Like when you are entering the realm of a book, and particularly if you are someone of non-Asian descent reading a book by anybody from any country within that, the huge, massive thing that is Asia, then you are accepting that you are going to have to acquire that lens. You are going to have to walk in that person's shoes and acquire their eyes and just see the world through their eyes. And ultimately, I think empathy and building empathy, that comes from reading books, but that is also what will then later translate in real life. When somebody's in a situation, maybe they won't say that stupid thing that they thought was really funny and a joke that turns out to be incredibly hurtful to somebody. Or maybe they will be in a situation where they're able to stop somebody from doing something really harmful. And I really think that quality of empathy, it's something that grows through reading, but it also is long lasting. So a book that somebody reads now, it could end up having some sort of really minimal or large impact a decade down the line, and somebody might not be able to trace it back to these books that they read, but it's still there. It leaves a footprint.
That's a great answer, and mine's slightly different. I feel like my work is inherently political. I'm also a very political person. Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, the novel that's finally coming out, which has been under contract since 2012, was originally, I know, hey, you gotta take the time, what time it takes. So,
persistence, Marie.
Well, it was originally a sort of George Eliot-ish, gigantic funny novel about like monetization in medicine, and it was sort of Michael Lewis-ishly post-capitalist novel. It's very funny. It was about 2 generations of Korean OBGYNs, and it was very twee. But then 2016 happened, and I just felt like I just can't deal with having some funny twee novel about the Mall of America anymore. And actually, my like writing colleague Charles Yu similarly just did this pivot. And part of the thing for me that just made me pivot and actually rewrite the whole novel was my parents were undocumented immigrants, and we grew up in a very rural area in Minnesota. And because my father was a doctor, yes, doctors are undocumented immigrants. He did basically the job that no homegrown American wanted to do. He was the town's anesthesiologist. So he ended up working on every single person who had a baby, you know, who had an chainsaw accident, any person who had a surgery. But then on this Facebook group from my hometown, somebody had this really stupid Trumpian, our whole town has become MAGA about, this is when Trump was really into North Korea, about how it was basically calling for genocide of North Koreans. It was like Trump wants, let's nuke North Korea. And I just thought, you know what, dudes, that's my dad. That's our family. And so I just kind of felt like, no, this seems like such a dumb, simple thing, but I'm going to have to humanize my North Korean character. And it ended up having, I ended up like traveling to North Korea, doing like totally changing the book, because then I just had my one goal. I want to show these jerks that no, the person who operated on them was not only undocumented, but he was North Korean. He was a communist. He was the person you're trying to kill. And that just became this whole raison d'etre for me for the newest version of my novel. And I just feel completely like art is inherently political, including for people who say it's not political. Do you know what I'm saying? Like those decisions are also political decisions.
Yeah.
So, but I agree with you. I don't want it to be didactic or like a lesson or set out like, I want to do this, but I do feel in the back of my mind that I do have a purpose that I wanted to serve.
Yeah. And you're building empathy by having your North Korean character like that. You're presenting them as they're a human being, just like we love putting labels on people like North Korea. Oh no, bad. No, this person is a human being. They have desires and wants and fears and all of that. And I feel like being able to follow those people in their lives, that's the only way to humanize them and then show somebody who doesn't understand, who has just created this caricature shell of what somebody like that is like, for them to see that no, they're just as human as you are.
And actually a bunch of my historian friends didn't even realize it's actually the US that partitioned Korea. It was never like, oh, there was this evil North Korea that always existed. The US partitioned Korea in 1945, and you're a historian and you don't know this. So that also became another driver of needing to show the US has caused many of the things for which we're like, oh no, they're evil. And like, no. The reason that these families are all separated and there's this evil North Korea is because the US separated it after the victory over Japan. Where Korea was
I love that, Marie. And I feel like a lot of the fiction I'm seeing, especially that was published in the last 5 to 10 years, I'm learning almost like alternative US history. Like, I went through a public school education system. There are so many things I didn't learn about. I mean, of course, slavery was incredibly whitewashed beyond belief. Like if I were to even look at the phrasing, I'm sure like if I went back and looked at my textbooks, there would be some really, really badly done things. But like what you just mentioned with the partition with North Korea, didn't know about that. I'm learning a lot about, the US occupation I remember as a child, like just learning about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and being in a class, like a debate class where you had to take a stance or, just for the exercise, like, was it right? Was the bombing right? Or was it not? And the entire class en masse being like, well, of course we had to bomb them. And in my head, I would never have said anything out loud, but in my head, in my heart, I was like, how is it right to drop a nuclear bomb on 2 cities? Like I couldn't understand it, but I just assumed I must have not known something that everybody else did because they were all in agreement. And it's only now with that recent anniversary that passed that you're reading all of these articles about how that bombing was not necessary for either city.
Particularly the second one. Let's drop another one.
Exactly. But just learning about, just all of that U.S. history of occupation and war, et cetera, in all of these countries. We are seeing a lot of fiction coming out the one that comes to the top of my mind is just Pachinko, Min-Jin Lee.
Right.
Yeah.
And just learning, for me, it's fascinating to learn because I don't like reading history books.
Right.
But of course, I love fiction. So it's just a fabulous way to learn about these things using a story. So I really look forward to your book.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait. It sounds wonderful. In the meantime, we unfortunately have to say goodbye, but I want to make sure folks know where to get both of your books. For Marie suggests Belmont Books in good old Belmont, Massachusetts, where you can order online. Woohoo! Yeah, Belmont Books, and you can go in physically as well. We love them. And then for Priyanka's book, you can get signed copies at Old Town Books in Alexandria. It's like Old Town Alexandria, right? Is that like a part of Alexandria? Okay. For those who are in the DC, Virginia area, you can check that out. And we'll absolutely, we got to have you back, Marie, next year when your book comes out.
Love it.
Yeah, that'll be awesome. So thank you both so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And this was great to listen to.
Thank you, Jane. And thank you, Marie. It was so lovely to finally meet you and talk to you.
I hope we can meet in real life soon.
Absolutely.
Here's to everybody in real life. Okay.
Thank you for coming, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for watching.
Thank you so much, everybody.
See you next week.